Hi guys, I've decided to record this uh, tips and tricks for optimizing renders. I'm pretty sure that you're very familiar with this stuff, but I also think that you can learn something as well, and you can also make a suggestion so I may learn something. And I also have some questions which and it will be great if you can have them answered for me. So I have made this one checklist with all the tips. So the first one says match camera reverse movements. That means that we can reuse some frames. For example, in this shot, you see the first frame, this frame, when it zooms in, matches this frame when it zooms out. Okay, when it zooms out, so this frame. So these frames are matched, this one and this one. So we can reuse this sequence of the body. As you can see, I have this sequence from zooming in into the body, and we can just time reverse it here. We don't have to render. We can just reuse and just apply reverse time here. Also, in this footage, when it makes an incision, the hole opens in the body, the retractors come into the play, so we can reuse this footage here. So this is just time reversing, okay, just going backwards into time, so we can just render this footage once. So everywhere when we have zoom in, zoom out, it's a best idea to match the camera on the starting position, so we can just time reverse it, these frames. Okay, so the next one will be reuse frames for similar animation and shots. I have made one animation here which has a different type of implant. As you can see here, this is the type of the implant. So this action is different. So when this piece comes into play and the implant, yeah, we can just render this sequence, but everything else from start to finish, from moving the spine, making the incisions, all of this can be reused. So we don't have to render these frames for this animation. I mean, this is common sense. I know this is basic stuff and it's familiar with you, but just to mention it, just to be on the same page, basically. Okay. Okay, this one is pretty useful and it saves tons of time, a ton of time, and it says render only moving parts. This means that, for example, in this shot, this portion of the shot is stationary, and this is the part that moves. Okay, so we can of course just render this portion. We can just render this frame as a still shot and just render this this sequence with ignoring this stuff and composite on top of each other. It says a little bit time, so it's useful to have it. And this saves a lot of time. Let me just show you. Yeah, this shot. So we can only render this frame of the body and composite the moving elements on top of each other. So that's what I mean by render only moving parts. We can only render this knife, which is the moving part, and everything else is stationary, so we don't have to re-render every time. But there is a trick on, it's not so simple as it seems, because this knife, we just cannot hide the body and this table and just render the knife. Because on the knife it should have this all sorts of reflections from the body and the table, or sorts of, I don't know, shadows, maybe global illumination stuff, and etc. So we want that information still to be applied on this knife and also these retractors, but we don't want to be calculate this object as a geometry, because this has subsurface scattering going on and maybe anti-aliasing going on. So we don't want that. We just only want reflections, GI shadows on this object. So we want to ignore this geometry at render time. I don't know how to do that in Modo, but I can demonstrate in Maya what I mean. For example, I have this pretty simple scene with just white cube and two spheres. And imagine if this white cube is the body and these spheres are, for example, the knife or the retractors. Okay. And we can use every information from this box, apply to this object, but ignore it on render time. So we don't have to render this portion. So we do that with material wrappers. So for example, I have this material here in Maya, which is called material wrapper. And I can plug this material, which is on the this white material, and assign it to the object. As you can see, I have here the options to matte the surface. So basically it will still calculate GI, shadows, reflection, and everything else, but it will ignore it in render time. So when I press render, as you can see, the GI is still here, but this object will not be rendered. So these spheres look exactly the same, but this object is not present. Okay, so this is very useful. And for example, in here, when the knife is cuts through the body, you can see it's kind of penetrates and it's cut off here. So it's not the whole piece. So also this surface will also matte this object. So it will just come out perfect as we need. And for example, in Maya, when I just reapplied my basic shader, and for example, apply the wrapper on this red sphere, so plug red material and assign on the sphere. So yeah, it will calculate all this information, but it will ignore the sphere in render time. But as you can see, it still casts shadow, GI, and reflection or everything else. So it will be great if you guys can show me how to do this in Modo, how to apply every information from these objects onto these objects, but these ones to be ignored in render time. So it will be this knife as a simple layer with all this information as if there were objects here, but it will just be composite on top of this still shot. it saves a lot of time. And also these objects can be also rendered as a separate layers. Okay, so I hope this makes a lot of sense to you guys. And I have number four lights as a primary illumination. So I've noticed that in Modo, in these scenes, we rely only on indirect illumination in basically HDR information. So for example, I can, let me just reapply my, okay, I have this light here in my scene. As you can see, I can turn it off and I can use my environment to act as a source of illumination, so it will produce basically the same result, because that's a dome, it was a dome light, so that casts information from all directions. So it's, yeah, the result is the same. Basically the intensity is, we can tweak that. Okay, so when rendering with indirect illumination only, the bad thing is that we can have a lot of flicker, and to avoid that flicker we have to just bump the settings of the global illumination, which slows the render a lot, and it will still not be completely illuminated. So the best solution is to use the dome lights that cast a light from all directions, and maybe we can use the HDR texture for its source, so it will be direct illumination, and we can use the indirect illumination just to smooth out the flicker. This method is faster, and it doesn't produce flicker, so we can bump the global illumination settings to basically minimum, and also not just to cut them, for example, in half, but we can also ignore them completely in some frames, which is this number 5, global illumination on nth frame. That means that when we have, for example, these fly-throughs, we don't have to calculate global illumination for every frame. So we can calculate from, for example, from this frame, for this frame, it will shoot all these rays in as a projection in these models. So, but we don't have to calculate in this with on this frame because they're similar. There is no need to add additional points, and we can do we can calculate from for this frame, ignore the another 5 maybe, calculate GI here, ignore for the rest, calculate GI here. So we can basically use, I don't know, maybe every 10th frame we can just calculate the global illumination and ignore for the rest. And it will also reduce the flicker and speed up the workflow, the render time. So for example, if we have slow motion like this, for example, we can calculate global illumination for every 30th frame, for example. So we don't need to wait for GI to be calculated for every single frame, which speeds the render time a lot. So here is the render layers and render passes. I use this technique in Maya, which I believe it will be very useful if you can tell me this, guys, how, if you can tell me, guys, how to do this in Modo. For example, I have these render layers and I've duplicated the objects on another layer and use this as a mask. For example, I've applied this surface shader here, And this surface shader is basically flat shader with no information of shadows or GI or anything. It's just basically a silhouette of an object. So I've applied white on the sphere and applied black on everything else. And when I go back to my original layer, everything is the same. And I can make some overrides, and I can turn off GI on this layer. So yeah, I can use this as a mask in post. I know that this can be done in Modo with render ID, but that produces all sorts of random colors. So for example, this red sphere can be green, this can be magenta, this can be blue. It's all random, but I want to know if there is a way of setting this custom. So I can assign black on this, and white on this. It will help me a lot when working in post, so I can pretty much use everything which is white as a mask in post. So I know that these render layers, maybe we can import the same scene, similar scene, and switch between the scenes, but it will be more convenient if I have these render layers, because it will be rendered in one take. So this will be added to the queue, and after this is finished rendering, this will be rendered, and we can have tons of layers, and with every single layer we can add additional passes on top of that layer. So I hope that this makes sense, and I hope that you can have some suggestion and tell me how to do this stuff that I've asked you to, so we can be on the same page basically, so we can have our renders very quickly. So thank you for your time, and see you. Bye bye.